Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
No calls, no texts, no lazy message tossed into the family group chat, no love you, kiddo from my dad or we've been so busy from my mom, just the kind of quiet that crawls under your skin and tells you exactly where you rank. So I did the thing adults do when they want to pretend everything is fine and went about my day, answered work emails, made coffee I did not finish, told myself they probably mixed up the date like they swear they always do even though somehow they never mix up my brothers, and I tried to be that practical version of myself who says birthdays are for children and I should not care. A few hours later, the universe decided to stop pretending along with me because my phone lit up with my brother's post, a glossy carousel of airport lounges and ocean views and champagne flutes that I could practically hear clinking. And the caption said the words that hit harder than any insult he could have typed: all expenses paid by our amazing parents, and I felt that sentence drop right through me because it did not just describe a trip, it announced a hierarchy that had never, not once, included me on the top half of the list. I stared at those photos longer than I want to admit, not because I envied the hotel or the ocean, but because I recognized the pattern in high definition. The one where I am the background character who sends polite thank you notes for practical socks, while my brother gets plane tickets and applause for breathing, and I remembered all the times I smoothed things over, the birthdays I hosted, the dinners I paid for without making a show of it, the holidays I arranged around other people's preferences, like a personal assistant who forgot to negotiate her salary, and I heard the oldest line my mother ever rehearsed slide back into my ear: "We love you both the same," which always translated to, "You will understand and he will receive." There is a point where you stop arguing with the scoreboard and simply stop playing, and I reached it right there on my couch with the half-cold coffee and the cheerful caption from the Golden Child. Because I understood that the only language anyone had taught this family to respect was distance, and I had never spoken it fluently, so I opened my settings and I began with the basics. Not a dramatic announcement or a paragraph designed to win a debate, just action that did not require permission or applause. I blocked my parents' numbers and my brother's number and the aunt who serves as the traveling press secretary. I unfollowed and muted and removed. I turned off location sharing that I had left on out of habit when I moved. I changed the label on my phone favorites from family to emergency only, and then I removed every contact that made the label a lie. I set a quiet filter that sends any message with my last name to an archive I will not open this year. And I stared at the empty screen. That followed like it was a room finally cleared of furniture that always bruised my shins. That might sound petty until you realize silence was the gift I had received that morning, wrapped in nothing and handed to me like a lesson, and I decided to return it with tracking and a signature required. Because for years I had been the reliable subscriber who paid on time and never complained, so I canceled the streaming profiles I added for them back when they could not figure it out. I ended the little autopay I had set up for their shared family phone plan when my dad's hours got cut, and never got restored when his hours came back. I changed the smart lock code they had insisted on knowing for emergencies that always looked suspiciously like dropping by unannounced to test my patience. And I pulled the spare key from the neighbor they had charmed into thinking they were harmless, because harmless people do not hold your childhood over your head like a coupon you should be grateful they did not forget to redeem. I did not send a statement or a manifesto or a heartfelt letter about boundaries, because people who ignore birthdays do not read essays, and besides, I did not want to fight. I wanted the kind of quiet that makes you check your phone and wonder if maybe you missed something. I wanted the accountability that arrives when the applause stops and you have to sit with the echo of your own choices. And while I was at it, I opened a new folder on my desktop and I named it Receipts, because if there is ever a dinner where history suddenly becomes disputed, I plan on being ready with more than feelings. And since I am done asking for the bare minimum like it is a favor, I scheduled a little reminder for myself for the next holiday season that says, "Do not fix it," which is my way of protecting the future me from doing the emotional janitorial work I always do when the family text starts buzzing with confused logistics and my mother pretends the group cannot survive without my helpful spreadsheets, because it can. It always could, they simply preferred not to. By the time the sun went down, I had done nothing anyone could screenshot and shame. I had not insulted, I had not begged, I had not performed my pain for public consumption. I had simply removed access and stopped subsidizing the version of family where I am useful but not valued, and in that clean, heavy quiet I could finally hear my own voice again, the one that does not need permission to protect itself. And I told myself out loud so there would be no debate later that this is not a tantrum. This is not a phase, this is the new standard, and anyone who wants to be in my life can start by remembering a birthday without being reminded. So when my phone vibrated with a single notification from an unknown number, and I saw the preview line begin with my mother's nickname for me like a hook thrown across a chasm, I did not open it. I watched the screen fade to black and I let the silence answer for me, because if you teach people that quiet does not mean absence, it means consequence, they eventually come knocking, and that is when things finally get interesting. The first few days after I cut them off were strangely peaceful. And for the first time in years my phone sat quietly on the table without buzzing with some half-hearted family message that always centered on my brother's newest achievement or my parents' endless commentary on how hard they worked to give us everything, which in their dictionary translated to everything for him and a reminder for me to be grateful. I thought maybe they would simply accept the silence, maybe they would even like it, since ignoring me had never been an issue before. But then the calls from unknown numbers began, the kinds that come in clusters, one after another. Like someone refusing to let go of a doorbell. I let them all go unanswered because I had made a decision, and I was not about to start explaining boundaries to people who spent 3 decades proving they had no interest in understanding them. I will admit there were moments when my hand hovered over the screen, when the part of me that still hoped for some normal version of family whispered that maybe this time would be different. Maybe they would actually say, "We messed up," instead of "You're too sensitive." But I had to remind myself that even on the morning of my birthday, when it would have taken 5 seconds to type a message, they had done nothing, and it was not forgetfulness, it was a choice. So I let the ringing die, I let the texts pile up in the blocked folder, and instead I started making small but deliberate adjustments that made it clear even to myself that this was not a temporary protest, but a new arrangement. I canceled the streaming accounts they used under my login without even thanking me. I ended the grocery delivery service that they had linked to my card under the excuse of "we'll pay you back," which somehow always slipped their memory. And I pulled every single digital tie that allowed them to benefit from me while pretending I was invisible. It felt almost surgical, the way I was cutting away these pieces of obligation I had carried, because for years I had convinced myself that being useful was the only way to earn affection, and yet the affection never came, just more requests, more excuses, and more reminders that whatever I gave would never be enough. My brother, of course, kept posting, and though I had muted him, friends who had no idea of the storm brewing would occasionally send me a link or screenshot with some comment like, "Wow, your brother is living the dream," and I would look at the captions about our amazing parents and feel the sting all over again. It was not about money, not really. It was about the fact that they could celebrate him so publicly and forget me so thoroughly, and then act shocked when I stopped playing along. After a week, the tone of their attempts shifted. My mother left a voicemail from a borrowed phone, her voice soft and rehearsed, saying they had been busy, that it slipped their mind, that I was making too much out of nothing, and that I needed to pick up before I did permanent damage to the family. I replayed that voicemail once, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to catch the exact moment her performance cracked, when her voice wavered just slightly on the word permanent, as if she was finally realizing that maybe, just maybe, I meant it this time. That was the first real taste of power I had ever had with them, not screaming, not crying, just doing nothing at all and letting them scramble in the silence they created. Of course, silence makes people nervous, and it did not take long for them to escalate from calls to physical presence. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw my parents' car parked across the street, and for a second my chest tightened like I was a child again caught in some invisible disobedience. But then I reminded myself I was a grown woman standing in front of my own house that I paid for with no help from them, and if they wanted to sit outside and sulk, they could burn through as much gas as they liked. I did not wave, I did not acknowledge them. I walked back inside and closed the door, and I sat on the couch with the TV on mute just to see if they would ring the bell. But they never did. They just sat there until finally pulling away. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and I wrote down a list of every shared account, every bill, every membership, every connection that had my name attached to theirs, and I made it my mission to sever them one by one. It was not glamorous revenge, but it was efficient and it was final. I froze the emergency credit card that I had let them use once when my dad's hours got cut, and that somehow became a permanent arrangement. I unsubscribed them from the travel points account that I had built through my work trips, but they used for his vacations. And I locked down my financial information so tightly that even if they tried to guilt me, they would find nothing to take. It felt like breathing cleaner air, like opening a window after years of stale smoke, and I realized that for all their talk about family, what they had really valued all along was access, and now that I had denied it to them, they were the ones left scrambling. And though it sounds small, that was my revenge in that moment, because the best part about silence is that you do not have to explain it. You just let people stew in it until they finally understand that the quiet is not empty. It is a boundary they never thought you were brave enough to set. And when my phone buzzed one last time that week with a message from my brother, a smug line about how mom and dad are worried sick about you, I did not even open it. I just deleted it and whispered to myself that the next time they came knocking, I would not just be ready, I would be the one controlling the story. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day when I had finally begun to feel the weight of silence turning into something almost comfortable, like a heavy coat I had chosen to put on instead of one forced over my shoulders. When suddenly the pounding on my front door broke that fragile peace and reminded me that silence is never truly safe when the people who fear it decide to drag you back into their noise. I froze at first, not because I was scared of them in the physical sense, but because I knew opening that door meant stepping back into a role I had sworn I would never play again, the role of the dutiful daughter who listens, who absorbs, who smooths over every jagged edge of their guilt and excuses until they look like victims in their own story. I peeked through the blinds, and there they were, both of them, my mother with tears streaking down her face and my father pacing like a man who could not believe his authority had been questioned, and for a moment I thought about ignoring it, letting them pound until they tired themselves out, but then something in me shifted, and I realized I wanted to hear just how far they would go when the performance was no longer on their stage, but mine. So I opened the door, not wide, just enough to look them in the eye without giving them the satisfaction of stepping into my home, and before I could even form a word my mother collapsed into a speech so polished I could tell she had been rehearsing it all week, sobbing that I was tearing the family apart, that my stubbornness was breaking her heart, that I was throwing away decades of love and care for no reason other than spite, and all I could think as she clutched her chest like an actress waiting for applause was that she still believed this would work on me. My father jumped in, his voice lower, steadier, with that condescending tone he always used when he thought logic would save the day, insisting that I was overreacting, that my brother's trip was just a nice thing they could afford now, that birthdays were not competitions, and that if I really loved them, I would not let something so small get in the way of family unity. I listened without interrupting, because sometimes silence cuts sharper than any rebuttal, and I could see the panic growing in their eyes as they realized I was not rushing to reassure them. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, and that calmness unsettled them more than any scream could have, because I began listing, one by one, the very moments they had sworn never happened. The Christmas mornings when my brother opened boxes of electronics while I unwrapped kitchen towels, the college years when I worked 2 jobs to cover tuition while they proudly bragged about paying for his classes, the countless times they excused his recklessness as boys will be boys while lecturing me about responsibility, and as I spoke I watched them both shake their heads like children caught in a lie they were still hoping to deny. My mother gasped that I was twisting things, that I was dredging up ancient history, and my father muttered that I had always been dramatic, and for the first time in my life I realized their greatest fear was not that I was angry, but that I remembered too clearly. They begged me to come to a family dinner, to sit down and talk things out like adults, though what they meant was to sit down and be gaslit back into submission. And I almost laughed at the irony of being told to act like an adult by people who still believed they could rewrite reality to fit their comfort. But instead of slamming the door, I agreed, not because I believed in their sudden desire for reconciliation, but because I wanted to see just how bold they would be when they thought they had me cornered. And I wanted to show them something I had been preparing for years without even realizing it, the truth they had buried under decades of denial. I told them I would come, that I would sit at their table and listen to every word, but that they should be ready for me to speak too, and the flicker of unease that crossed my father's face was almost enough to make the whole charade worthwhile. They nodded quickly, too quickly, and my mother wiped her eyes and tried to hug me, but I stepped back, because that hug was not love, it was leverage, and I was not about to hand her the weapon she wanted. I closed the door on them with the date for dinner hanging between us like a loaded gun, and for the rest of the evening I sat in the quiet and thought about how strange it felt to no longer be the child begging for recognition, but the woman planning her own stage where every lie, every excuse, and every denial would finally be forced into the light. And as I poured myself another glass of wine, I realized I was not nervous about the dinner, not even slightly, because for the first time I understood that revenge does not always require cruelty. Sometimes it only requires patience, memory, and the willingness to let people trap themselves in the lies they swore you would never dare to confront, and that thought alone made me almost look forward to the show they were about to put on. Walking into that dinner felt less like joining a family gathering and more like stepping onto a stage where the script had already been written by people who assumed I would play the role they had rehearsed for me since childhood, the quiet daughter who listens more than she speaks, who absorbs slights with a forced smile, who swallows her resentment until it no longer tastes bitter, and who always finds a way to turn insults into excuses because peace in the family is supposedly worth more than truth. The restaurant they chose was one of those overly polished places they only ever suggested when my brother was being celebrated, which meant I already knew the tone before I even sat down, and sure enough, the moment I approached the table, I could see the performance beginning, with my mother smiling through watery eyes as if nothing had happened, my father sitting stiff with the confidence of someone convinced logic would eventually break me down, and my brother leaning back in his chair with that insufferable grin that told me he was expecting this dinner to end with me apologizing for daring to feel hurt in the first place. I let them greet me. I let them say how glad they were that I had come, and I let them order without objection, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply let people dig their own graves with words they think are harmless. The conversation started with small talk, all of it revolving around my brother's recent trip, the one that had been blasted across social media like a victory parade, and they described the luxury hotel, the private tours, the special meals that our amazing parents had arranged, all while carefully avoiding any mention of why I had cut them off in the first place. I listened with the kind of calm detachment you get when you already know the ending of a story, and when my brother laughed loudly about how spoiled he was, my mother gently scolded him in a tone that was more indulgent than critical. And then she turned to me with a smile so fake it could have been carved, asking if I was over the little misunderstanding. That was my moment, the one I had been waiting for, the point where their smugness gave me the opening to pull out the arsenal I had been quietly preparing for years, not out of malice, but out of the need to prove to myself that I was not crazy, that I had not invented the favoritism or exaggerated the neglect, that the story of my life was not some bitter delusion, but a collection of verifiable facts they had simply chosen to bury. I leaned forward, and in the same even tone I had used at the door the week before, I began listing the years, the birthdays, the Christmas mornings, the tuition bills, the financial records, the text messages, and even the screenshots I had quietly saved when my brother posted about yet another gift or perk that never once had my name attached. I spoke slowly, deliberately, refusing to raise my voice, because this was not rage, it was record-keeping, and with every example I dropped onto that table, I watched the smugness falter, the smiles twitch, the confidence crack. My father shook his head, muttering that I was exaggerating, that I was making a scene, but I cut him off, reminding him that I had receipts, literal receipts, bank statements, and screenshots, all neatly saved and ready. And I could show them right there at the table if he wanted to pretend memory was not enough. My mother gasped that I was embarrassing the family in public, and I laughed quietly, because the only people at that table embarrassed were the ones caught in their own hypocrisy. My brother, unsurprisingly, brushed it off with that lazy arrogance of his, saying I was always jealous, always dramatic, always trying to make myself a victim when really, I should just be happy that the family had enough to give him nice things. And in that moment the line between denial and confession disappeared, because he had said out loud what they had always implied: I was never meant to be equal, only useful. I sat back then, letting the weight of my words hang in the air, and when my mother reached for my hand in one last attempt at emotional manipulation, I pulled away and told them calmly that I was done pretending. I told them that every year I had given them chances, and every year they had chosen to ignore me until it became convenient to drag me back into their version of family, and that this dinner, this performance, this little staged attempt at reconciliation, was the last time I would ever allow myself to sit quietly and swallow the script they had written for me. Their faces fell, their voices stumbled, and for the first time I saw genuine fear flicker in their eyes, because it had finally dawned on them that the daughter who always bent was no longer bending, and that the silence they had once mistaken for weakness was actually the sound of a door closing. When the check arrived, I stood up before they could even attempt the ritual of letting me cover it, and I said, in the clearest voice I could manage, that I had no intention of paying for another performance, and that they should enjoy their meal since it was the last one they would ever share with me under the illusion of family. I walked out without looking back, because I already knew the next act, the one where they would show up again, crying and pleading outside my house. But this time the ending would be mine to write, and it would not include forgiveness. The days after that dinner felt different, not because I was suddenly free of the weight of my family's neglect, but because I knew I had stood in front of them, laid out the evidence they had spent years denying, and refused to let them twist me back into submission. And while they might never admit it, I could feel the shift, the way they looked at me with something closer to fear than disappointment, the way their voices faltered when they realized my calm was not weakness, but the kind of strength that does not ask for permission. I thought maybe they would retreat into their own world, lick their wounds, and spin their stories to relatives who were all too eager to believe that I was difficult, selfish, or dramatic, and in truth I did not care anymore. Because the only thing that mattered was that I was finally done begging for space at a table where my presence had never been wanted. But of course, people like my parents do not go quietly when they sense they are losing control, and it was only a matter of days before the knock on my door returned, heavier this time, less a request for entry and more a demand to be heard. I ignored it at first, because I knew if I opened that door too soon I would be dragged back into their cycle, the same apologies laced with accusations, the same tears meant to disarm me, the same circular logic that had always left me exhausted and guilty. And I had no intention of letting them reset the game. Yet when the pounding turned into sobs outside my window, I finally stood where I could see them but not touch them, and there they were, my parents, sitting on my porch steps like teenagers who had been grounded, crying into their hands, whispering my name as though the performance of pain would somehow erase years of their calculated silence. It would have been easy to give in at that moment, to open the door and play the role they had written for me, the one where I comfort them, where I reassure them that we are still a family, where I shoulder the blame for daring to call out the truth. But instead I stayed inside, my hand on the curtain, my face out of sight, and I let the silence do the talking for me. I realized then that revenge is not always some dramatic confrontation or clever scheme that flips the story in a single stroke. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to participate in the script they have forced on you, leaving them to sit in the discomfort of the very void they created, making them understand in real time what it feels like to be ignored, dismissed, and made invisible. I could hear my mother wailing that she had no idea what went wrong, that she had always tried her best, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the audacity it takes to stand outside your daughter's home, crying for forgiveness, while still denying the very truth she spelled out for you days earlier with undeniable proof. My father's voice broke through, lower, rougher, promising that they could do better if I would just give them another chance. And I thought about all the times I had given them that chance already, every holiday where I smoothed things over. Every birthday where I swallowed the absence, every family gathering where I made myself small so that peace could survive one more day, and I felt the sharp clarity of knowing I had already done my part more times than anyone could reasonably ask. So I did not open the door. I let them sit there until the sobs quieted, until the murmurs became whispers, until eventually the sound of their car pulling away marked the end of yet another performance that failed to reach its audience. I stood there in the empty house, not triumphant in the way movies make revenge look, but steady, grounded, and unshaken, because the victory was not in humiliating them or forcing some dramatic apology. The victory was in reclaiming the silence they had once weaponized against me and making it mine, a silence that no longer represented absence or punishment, but peace, control, and the decision to choose myself over people who had never chosen me. I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, the same couch where weeks earlier I had stared at my brother's smug vacation post and felt the sting of being invisible, and I realized just how far I had come in such a short time. From the woman begging for recognition to the woman who could sit in her own home without fear, without guilt, without apology, knowing that her life was finally hers. They could spin the story however they wanted to the outside world, they could cry to relatives or complain to friends, they could twist it into another narrative where I was the problem, but at the end of the day, they would still be the ones standing outside my locked door, crying for entry into a space they no longer had access to, while I sat inside with the knowledge that I had finally won by doing the one thing they never expected me to do, nothing. And as the night settled in and the quiet wrapped itself around me, I thought about how strange it was that the greatest revenge I could ever deliver was not shouting, not fighting, not even exposing them further, but simply refusing to play along. Leaving them to wrestle with the silence they had taught me to endure, and for the first time in my life, that silence did not feel like abandonment, it felt like freedom.